Erev Tov, welcome everyone. I'm so excited. This is actually a rescheduled class. So I want to say, thank goodness that Rabbi Schatz is feeling much better. Rabbi Schatz and I have been friends for many years, high school, college, camp. I think we have more people in common on Facebook than any of my other friends. And like many of my very close friends, she also went the path of Jewish educator and rabbi. And in fact, she went to the same school as one of our last guest speakers, Rabbi Louis Sachs. So we're all from a very similar friend group. And she's not only an incredibly talented rabbi, both in terms of spiritually and pastorally reaching out to each other, intellectually and teaching classes. And I've actually had an opportunity to learn from her and teach classes with her in the past. But she's also talented in countless other ways, musically as well. And I'm very excited for her not only to teach us some very important Torah, about two key mitzvot in the Torah, wearing Tallit and Tefillin, and how they're related to women in the Torah, but also to share some of her experiences, both personally and perhaps of her congregants, not specifically, but some others who may have asked her, and how she guided them.
Before we actually look at the texts, I'm curious to know what you know of Tallit and Tefillin for female identifying people. So what have you heard about it? Maybe you wear it, but what is your kind of relationship to these two mitzvot, and either factually or anecdotally, how you've come to connect yourself to Tallit and Tefillin? Yeah, Lynn. I think you have to unmute yourself first, or I have to unmute you, or yeah, go ahead.
Rashi's daughters.
Rashi's daughters. Okay, great. So whether or not it is true, in the Talmud, we understand that, and also from the book, Rabbi's daughters, Rashi's daughters, sorry, it's been a long day. I know longer for you, but we understand that Rashi seemed to have taught his daughters, not just the mitzvah of Tallit and Tefillin, but seemed to have taught his daughters many of the mitzvot that are categorically male mitzvot for his daughters to also partake in, making them also learned women and people in the community. So great, that is definitely one that people have come to know. Anything else about Tallit and Tefillin? Yeah, Jane. Just unmute yourself.
Yeah, I can say that in the two conservative synagogues that I have been part of in the past,
yeah,
it's been voluntary, and some people have and some people haven't. Great.
So very often you will find, I actually don't know of any community that does this, whether or not this is the correct way of dealing with it or not. Most communities are saying it is optional for women and mandatory for men, right? In the Reform world, which I am not, a professional in, but I do have many colleagues who work in that world. I know that it is much more strongly recommended. Sometimes girls who go to either non-denominational or Reform schools or camps are asked to wear a kippah, for example, just like a male would be. But in the school that I grew up in the school that I teach in the synagogue that I work in, we mandate it for boys and for men, for anybody after bar mitzvah age who is identifying as a male. And then for anybody identifying as a female, it's something that you are allowed to do, but not obligated to do. And again, there are many feelings around that, especially in the liberal egalitarian world, especially because wearing a kippah is not. Some would even say, and this is another class for another time, but some would say that wearing a kippah is not even a halachic thing to do at all, and therefore why are we mandating it for boys but making it optional for girls? Susan, you have a question or a statement?
Yeah, my daughters went to the local day school.
Yeah.
And we went to a lot of bat mitzvahs when they were going through school, and a lot of the bat mitzvah girls would wear a tallit, and there was one particular congregation I won't name, but
you won't know it, so you can name it.
Okay, well, the girl would be wearing a tallit, usually sort of like off the shoulders, like a stole, and the rabbi would make a big fuss and say, this is the same tallit that her older sister wore when she had her bat mitzvah. And I sort of thought in a catty way, and when the the third sister has a bat mitzvah, it'll be worn another time.
Right,
But,
right.
yeah.
Right. So often, especially, at a time when this was just beginning in the liberal world, in the liberal Jewish world, a tallit was kind of seen as just like a ritual item, just like we give our bar and bat mitzvah students like a kiddush cup when they finish their bar and bat mitzvah, or candlesticks or whatever. I always think it's very funny that we hand our bar and bat mitzvah kids muksa on Shabbat, but neither here nor there. But we give them these items that are to be put out and to be used. But the tallit kind of turned into that item from the beginning. I will say that my tallit at my bat mitzvah, I wore at my bat mitzvah, and then I never wore again until I was leading high holiday services at Indiana University, and I had to wear a tallit, and that was the only one that I owned. But I didn't wear it as an item to wear all the time. Boys, even in the egalitarian world, are wearing their tallit from the time, as long as it's their custom, which in the Ashkenazi world it isn't always. But if it's their custom, they're wearing the tallit from the time of their bar mitzvah, every Saturday and every day if they're in day school, that follows in terms of part of their prayer practice. So the reason that I asked about this is because some of the language is actually what's most important when it comes to these different elements of these two mitzvot. Now, kippah is not part of tallit and tefillin in terms of the mitzvot, but often when we're talking about them, especially like in a camp setting or in a day school setting, you hear kippah, tallit, and tefillin, because those are the items, so to speak, that if a kid shows up for daily minyan at their Schechter school, that they might need to have, or else they aren't fulfilling their obligation of being in that minyan. So the different vocabulary that I want us to be using, and then we'll look at the source sheet, is obligated, exempt, and optional, right? So exempt and optional are pretty close to the same. Oh, sorry. Exempt and optional are pretty close to the same thing, but the fourth word was prohibited, right? So obligated is that someone has to take this on as long as they are committing themselves to mitzvot. They have to take this on as a mitzvah that is theirs. It is an obligation of theirs. So a boy turns 13 years old. He now has obligations to take on tallit and tefillin. It does not say that a girl is obligated to take those things on. However, only in the more modern day text does it say that she is prohibited from it. So when we look at the different mitzvot of tallit and tefillin, you will never see that a girl is obligated, but you also, not until our rabbis get very nervous later on in like the 20th century, do you see, maybe the 19th century, do you see that the rabbis start to say that it's prohibited. The middle section of exempt versus exempt and what was the other word I used? Optional, thank you. I knew it was an O. Exempt and optional is actually a very beautiful space to sit in for female mitzvot. Now, if you are a staunch feminist, which I hope many of you, if not all of you, are, that's a very hard thing to hear, because all of a sudden it's like, well, women can, but they don't have to. There's no strength behind it. But in terms of female mitzvot in the Jewish tradition, which was written by men for men, it's actually a really beautiful middle ground to understand these mitzvot through. Because what it's saying is a bunch of men wrote these laws about male ritual items to say women do not have to take them on. They are not obligated to them, but we're also not telling them that they cannot take them on. There's nothing that says that they are prohibited from the act of putting on tallit and tefillin. So that's where the conservative movement swoops in and says, well, okay, if the rabbis are not telling us that we are prohibited from something, then there's a window for us to choose to obligate ourselves as women if we are going to see ourselves in an egalitarian setting. Right? There are other things, again, other classes for other times, where the conservative movement has done the same thing that might be a little bit more problematic in terms of equalizing the playing field. But when it comes to tallit and tefillin, something that I can take out of a bag just like a man can and put on the same body parts that a man can, that allows me to see the option for it to be equal for me and for a male colleague. Is everybody with me so far? Does anybody have any questions about any of that language thus far before we look at some of the texts? Okay. Had people, just like thumbs up, thumbs down, have people heard of these different key terms before? Obligated, exempt? Okay, great. I'm glad that Rabbi Dinan had that. That makes me very happy. Okay, so let's look here at this source sheet. So this is a source sheet that Rabbi Dinan put together and that I annotated a bit, just to kind of get a bit of my point across. Great, thank you, Shelley, for saying yes. Can you all see this source sheet? Yeah, okay, perfect. So yeah, go ahead. Were you gonna say something?
Nope,
No?
go for it.
Okay. By the way, I just want to point out, this is something that Rabbi Dinan said as part of my introduction, but we grew up in the same spaces of being in conservative, liberal, egalitarian spaces. And yet, when I grew up, wearing tefillin was not something that I ever even thought of as an option nor an obligation. It was only until I was in rabbinical school that I even approached the topic of wearing a tallis or tefillin. Again, similar to what I think it was Susan, similar to what Susan said about, receiving a tallit on your bat mitzvah and then kind of putting it away or giving it to the next daughter, which I don't have any sisters, so that didn't happen in my family. But that idea of it being kind of a piece that you have just for that day was very much still in my life, and I'm not a very old person. So this is something that in the early 2000s was still around as not a staple of feminine ritual, but still kind of a fluid, if you want to, you can. Yeah, Rabbi Dinan.
There's just a request to increase the font, but you could do it easy and just select
yes.
all and just raise it by a couple.
I'm going to do it this way, I think.
I think that's great.
Because that
I just got a nod from the person who requested it, so I think that's
awesome.
Wonderful.
Perfect.
Excellent. Thank you, Rabbi.
I meant to do it earlier, so I'm sorry that I forgot. Okay, so we're first going to look at this text from Shemot. This is just a text from Exodus that is telling us what the mitzvah is for tefillin. We're going to look at tefillin first. I presume that everybody knows what tefillin is, but is that true? Everyone knows what tefillin is, what we wear on our arms and on our head. Straps that are not at all comfortable, let me just tell you. It says here, it shall be a sign for you. So v'hayalecha le'ot al yadecha. So ot, which we translate in English as sign, but it's really just like a something, right? We're gonna put a something on our hand, potentially a sign. Ulazikaram b'neinecha. And as a remembrance, as something to be able to remember this by, between your eyes, in order that God's Torah be in your mouth, because God took you out from Egypt with a strong hand. Seems like a holiday we just celebrated. You shall keep this ordinance in its appointed time from year to year. Okay, so we know from this one line that doesn't say tefillin anywhere, you might notice, that we have to have a something on our arm and a something between our eyes to have the memory of this moment with us when we're praying. Yeah, Rabbi Dinan.
As I say, one thing that I left out of here is there's 4 or 5 more verses in the Torah that talk about tefillin. Never uses the word tefillin, but it does add the word totafot. You should put them as totafot, and the Torah doesn't ever define that. So I don't know if you were going to talk about that, but there's a whole separate class about how we get from these verses to the black boxes. But we do know from archaeology that the kind of tefillin we're familiar with today, the black leather boxes with the scrolls with these verses on them, or some of these verses, are at least 2,000 years old. So I didn't include that here. You can say more about it, but I just wanted to give that quick background. I focused on the text about whether or not women are obligated to wear them and who is.
Yeah, I wasn't gonna get into that either, but it is very interesting, obviously, that it doesn't tell us in these Torah texts, right, specifically using the language that we use today. It's only later on that our rabbis tell us how to make them, what to make them out of, what verses go in them. Many of the verses are the verses that Rabbi Dinan just mentioned that we can find later on in the Torah as well. So that's where the mitzvah comes from. As you'll notice, it says nothing about men. It says nothing about women. It just says that this is something that you do, right? So when we're looking critically at text, which in my denomination we do all the time, we are looking at this text and saying, okay, how wonderful. This doesn't tell me that it's just for men. So now I see an opening for why would it be that women couldn't or that women should. Okay, so in Brachot, in the Mishnah, which is written in about 200 CE, we get the first kind of mentioning of part of this language, of the vocabulary that I used earlier, Nashim ve'avadim uktanim. So this is a category that we see a lot when it comes to laws in Rabbinic Judaism. We often get, sometimes it's clumped together with animals as well. Do with that what you will. But often we see women, slaves, and children in the same category in terms of what is obligated to them and what is not. And here we see Nashim ve'avadim uktanim, women, slaves, and children, peturin. They are exempt. Mikriyat Shema umin Tefillin. They are exempt from reciting the Shema, and they're exempt from putting on Tefillin. So again, it doesn't say that they are forbidden from, it just says that they are exempt from. So what does that mean? I'm happy to take a comment or two on this. What do you think, if you were to stop here, what do you think that means in terms of women wearing tefillin? Yeah, Lynn, just unmute first.
They are both, as are many other mitzvot, time-bound, and women are exempt from time-bound mitzvot.
Great. So you're getting a little bit ahead of us here. We're going to get to the idea of time-bound mitzvot in just a second. But if you were just to read this piece here, which says nothing about time-bound, right? It's just saying that you don't have to do the Shema, you don't have to put on tefillin. What does that tell us about women and also slaves and also children? But what does it say about this category of reciting the Shema and putting on tefillin?
There's no context there other than putting a modern lens over what does it feel like to be lumped in with the kids and the slaves. But there's no context here to understand what might have been going on before or after it.
Okay.
That would be maybe be a hint toward the exemption.
Sure. So there is a sense that these three categories of people are being lumped together for some reason, right? And as Lynn is pointing out, it's unclear to us why that might be. There's no context for that. We could all use our imagination in that these are categories of people either who have no halachic obligation because they're children, so they don't have any obligation to begin with, and slaves and women had obligations in terms of, as Lynn was pointing out before, time elements of their lives that they might not be able to stop and say the Shema or stop and put on tefillin. A modern woman would fight back with me and say, of course they could have, they just didn't think that they had to, right? So there would have been ways to get around it, but they didn't. Yeah, Rabbi didn't.
So two things. One is to Lynn's question, the context here is very interesting. In the third chapter, it talks about somebody who has just lost an immediate relative and they're in the immediate stages of mourning. And the classic thing is they were exempt from patur, from saying the Shema,
Right.
because they were just overwhelmed emotionally. And then oftentimes in the Mishnah, things are associative. We're already talking about people who are exempt from Shema, so here's another one. And then for the actual thing, like just the simple understanding of it is that these three people do not have to say Shema, which Rabbi Schatz will say more about, but at least from like a more general sense, these three categories clearly have a different relationship with the Torah, at least these specific commandments and mitzvot, whether that means they're lower or lesser or just different. But it's clear the way they're lumped together is the Torah is not the same to them as it is to men. And again, a lot of baggage is included in that, some rightfully so, and some is added later. But those are the two takeaways that I get from it.
Right, exactly. And one of the things that we also get from the Shema and Tefillin specifically is that, again, it has nothing to do with specific differences in body parts, right? Or in any kind of gender or sexuality that might really make a difference, right? You cannot ask a man to practice the laws of Nida, which have to do with female menstruation, because Men don't menstruate. So there's no way for us to ask men to take on a mitzvah that has to do with female bodies and vice versa. But here we're not talking about, men aren't the only ones with arms and foreheads, or mouths to say the Shema, right? So we're not talking about a gender or sex difference. We're just talking about a difference in terms of, as we're going to get to in just a second, the responsibilities that these categories of people had around actual time-bound mitzvot. So we're going to go from the Mishnah to the Talmud. So we're going to go from the rabbis kind of categorizing what these mitzvot might be, asking the questions, so to speak, and then the Talmud really fleshes it out so that we can understand a little bit more about what's being asked of us by the rabbis. Interestingly, for those of you who have studied Mishnah to Talmud in the past, this goes from Mishnah Brachot to Talmud Kiddushin. So it's not even the same tractate, right? When we're talking about brachot, as Rabbi didn't mention, we're talking about those who have lost somebody and the things they now do not have to do in this period of aninut. But then when we get into Kiddushin, we're really talking much more about women and their in a specific moment and their specific connection to mitzvah and to commandment. So here it says, I'm just going to read it in the English because I would guess that most of us are not fluent in Aramaic, so it'll be quicker for us to understand in the English. When do we know that women are exempt from positive time-bound mitzvot? So we already have the assumption that women are exempt. Again, they are not prohibited from, but they're also not obligated to, time-bound mitzvot. We can learn this from the mitzvah of Tefillin. Just as women are exempt from Tefillin, so too women are exempt from all positive time-bound commandments. And learn Tefillin from Talmud Torah. This is the one that really gets people up in arms. Just as women are exempt from Talmud Torah, so too women are exempt from Tefillin. Okay, again, exempt. If you want to be angry about this, I totally understand the argument and the anger. And at the same time, it's not saying you're prohibited from learning Torah. It's just saying you might not have as much time to learn Torah as the men who are actually obligated to do so. And so you might find yourself in this category of, oh, if I can't do it today, I wasn't obligated anyway, but tomorrow I might be able to. So you're exempt from the time-boundedness, which I don't think is a word, to actually do these things, but they are available to you if you have interest in doing them. So I'm not actually going to read the rest of it because it just goes on to compare these different things. But this is a very important piece of learning, specifically for those of you who are in a class right now of Torah learning, right? Anybody who identifies as a female on this call is choosing to not see themselves as exempt from Talmud Torah. You might not see yourself as obligated to it, but you definitely don't see yourself as forbidden from it, but you also are not choosing to be exempt from it. You're putting yourself on a higher level than exemption. So this is important when it comes to Tefillin and to Tallit, because if a person shows up at your synagogue and says, I've taken on this mitzvah for myself, there really is no reason, other than some of the modern reasons that we'll come to in a moment, there really is no reason, according to our rabbis of the 200s and the 500s and 600s, that women shouldn't be able to say, this is a mitzvah I've taken on. This is something that I can do. The time in my life does allow me to take on this mitzvah, and so I'm going to. I'll get a little bit more into my own personal story when we get away from the ancient texts, but I will say that exemption is a bit of a snowball effect. When you know enough law that you a female, know that you are exempt from something, you wake up in the morning and you think to yourself, I'm not really so sure that I want to go to Minyan today and put on Tefillin, and you think to yourself, oh, I'm not obligated, I don't have to go. That there's a snowball effect there, because if you constantly see yourself as exempt from something, you're going to end up in a category of not doing those mitzvot. However, if you obligate yourself to something, you've really held yourself to a very high standard that just isn't always possible. So just keep that in mind, because especially when we're talking about females and wanting to make sure that female identifying persons feel welcome to do things and feel included, it's sometimes nice to not have to feel that way at all moments of your life, when there still are certain gender differences in the way in which a potential household, not every household, is run, such that the exemption might be a nice little cushion. So just keep that in mind. We'll talk about that a little bit more, or I'll talk about that a little bit more in my own life in just a moment. Okay, this is just bringing back the Mishnah piece to tell you that it's now become law. So in the Shulchan Aruch, which is our code of Jewish law, it is telling us that in fact, women and slaves have now been told that they do not have to take on the mitzvah of tefillin because it's time bound. By the way, when we say slaves, we're talking about male slaves. So it's female or all slaves, but specifically in this category, we're not saying females and female slaves. We are saying females and also people who are enslaved. Yeah, Lynn.
If you're saying male slaves, what about the differentiation between an Eved Ivri and an Eved Knaani, a Jewish slave and a non-Jewish slave?
I think it's a great question. I have not looked into it in terms of the actual mitzvah of tefillin. Maybe Rabbi Dinan has. I believe that this is just the category of someone who is enslaved, right? I just got back from a trip to the South where I learned that saying a slave does not actually put as much responsibility on the person who enslaved that human, which is how we should talk about them. So a person who is enslaved does not have time on their own hands. Their time is someone else's. So I don't think that it would necessarily matter whether or not they are in either category. I think it's just focusing on time that is yours versus time that is not yours. But maybe Rabbi Dinan has a different response.
Yeah, so you said something incredibly important that I just want to emphasize about time belonging to yourself. So the reason that women are considered by the rabbis to be not obligated by time-bound mitzvot, generally, and this is oversimplifying, is because they have other responsibilities that would not allow them to, set their day by mitzvot, taking care of a family, et cetera, like that. And that would be true of these indentured servants. It wasn't good, but they weren't quite slaves. These indentured servants they were serving their masters. They didn't have time to make their days go to minyan and everything like that. But whereas an Eved Knaani, a non-Jewish slave, wouldn't be obligated in any mitzvot. There's certain things they have to do because they're in the house of a Jew, but they don't have to keep any mitzvot. An Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave, and a woman do have to keep some mitzvot. So a non-Jewish indentured servant is in a separate category altogether. But in terms of, so this is talking about Jewish slaves. These avadim here are Jewish slaves that are obligated in certain mitzvot. They can't kill, they can't eat pork and stuff like that, but they don't have to say Shema. They're exempt from saying Shema and Tefillin. But an Eved Knaani, no one would even think that they would ever have to do Shema and Tefillin because they're not Jewish. They just live in the house of a Jew. And again, there's certain things there that they have to follow, but they're not Jewish. So this is Jewish bondsmen, as it were.
Right, just like we would never expect, a maintenance person who works in a synagogue to have to put on talis and tefillin walking into a sanctuary, right? It's the same. That was a really good point. I didn't even think about the religion part of it. But yeah, we are only talking about Jews because mitzvot only categorize based on Jews, not on non-Jews. Okay. I'm trying to decide. Okay, I'm not going to read this. Well, I'll read it. Okay, so here is one. Here is one text that allows us to see where the rabbis, not only did they say that it was exempt, but the rabbis went as far as to not care if it was happening, right? That this was something that was actually maybe not encouraged, but definitely not put down as something that women should be embarrassed by in terms of their practice of Judaism. Michal, the daughter of Cushi, would lay tefillin, and the sages did not protest. Okay, the sages did not protest is a huge statement to make, right? Because if the rabbis didn't want someone to do something, they would have been up in arms about it. So this seems to mean that this woman, Michal, was able to actually put on tefillin without anybody caring. The rabbis didn't care, the sages didn't care, they might have been one and the same, but people did not seem to mind that Michal was putting on tefillin. And the wife of Yonah would make a festive pilgrimage, and the sages did not protest, right? There's another thing that is not necessary for women to do. We can derive from their non-protest that whether or not we're talking about a person here or I don't think we're actually talking about God, but Rabbi Dinah and I can argue on this, but I think we're actually talking about the rabbis themselves. That pilgrimage was voluntary, performance of a positive time-bound mitzvah. Again, it's similar, the same category, but they're just using going up to the temple on one of the Shlosh Regalim as part of this. Here too, Michal's wearing of tefillin is voluntary, performance of a positive time-bound mitzvah. So what the rabbis, the sages are doing here, the Chachamim are doing here, is basically saying women would do this and we were okay with it. And women would do other things like make pilgrimage on the Shalosh Regalim to the temple, and we were also okay with that. So if they were able to do it, again, exempt, maybe making themselves obligated or just able to do so, they could do these mitzvot, and that was okay by us. If it was prohibited, they would not have okayed it. Right? So the sages would not have just kind of turned a blind eye if it was prohibited. This is a very strong statement in the rabbis saying it's not up to us, basically, right? They're choosing to do this, and that's okay, because if their time allows for it, they're doing it. The one thing I want to point out is that just because the time boundedness does not seem to match up to women's lives. Women weren't allowed to choose whatever time they wanted to do these things. So if they wanted to put on tefillin, they weren't choosing to put on tefillin at 8 p.m. when they had the time after they had put the kids to bed. They were choosing to put on tefillin when the men were also putting on tefillin. So it doesn't say that here, but I want everybody to have the concept of if women are taking on these mitzvot, they're at the same time and to the same capacity as men. They're just, whether or not they are doing them as regularly would make them obligated or not. Okay, we're gonna move to I'm trying to give you all enough time to ask questions. There's a lot of text here. Okay, we can read this one text here from Sefer HaChinuch, and then we can move on. So we're just going to read the bolded part that I put here. So if women want to lay tefillin, we do not protest, meaning the rabbis, the sages, the people around them do not protest, and they have a reward, but not like a man's reward. For the reward of one who is commanded and performs is not like the reward of one who is not commanded and performs. So basically this is where if I decide to be angry about any of this is where I would start to get angry, because who cares, right? It's not up to you to tell me what I get a reward for. If it's something that's important to me and I've made it an obligation, well, then of course I get the same kind of reward. Now, God hasn't come down yet to Temple Beth Am to tell me whether or not my reward is better than Rabbi Klinkfeld's, my senior rabbi, because he's a man and I'm a woman and I put on tefillin and he also puts on tefillin. So what the rabbis are getting at in this particular text is saying, because a man is doing it as an obligated person, the reward for that mitzvah is higher than a person who just chooses for it to be their mitzvah. Now, if I was writing a 2022 text on this and I wanted to kind of flip this on its head, I would say, actually, if you are obligated to something, that makes you not so special in taking on that mitzvah. It should be the person who has now made the time for it and decided that it's important to them to be able to take on this mitzvah, and they should get that reward because it's something they had to seek. It's something that they had to go after and probably fight for, and not just something that was handed to them as something they had to do. Now, that is the conservative Jew in me coming out wholeheartedly, as opposed to the Orthodox Jew, which I'm not. But the idea around that reward, to me, seems a little bit on its head. But what the rabbis are trying to say is basically obligation equals reward. Exemption, awesome, go for it, but the reward is not as high. Okay, you'll see down here, the Panani Halacha, I actually believe he's still alive, but it's a modern text, and you'll see here that this is the most modern of the texts that we're reading, and all of a sudden women cannot wear tefillin. There are many reasons. I didn't bring it today because I didn't want it to be focus of today's class, but if you're interested, one of the reasons that many people decided that women should not wear tefillin is because of menstruation, that the rabbis were concerned that women would not know how to keep their bodies clean. There are lots of ways in which if a male is having any kind of bowel issue or is even passing gas, they're not supposed to be wearing tefillin. So it's not just to say that women have gross bodies and so they can't wear tefillin, but the rabbis did not understand women's bodies in the same kind of way. Understandably, they were living in male bodies, that they could understand how women might be able to have control over their bodies in the same way that a man would, in different ways and at different times throughout their life. But the rabbis were worried that if women wore tefillin, they would somehow, and I use this word very, very lightly because I don't actually believe this is the right word, but somehow dirty the ritual of wearing tefillin because their bodies were not in a state of tahor to be able to wear them. We're not going to talk, you can ask me questions about that later, but I'm not going to talk about that too much. I want to very briefly talk about Tallit because it's, to me, it's the ritual that comes kind of with the least amount of controversy, and it doesn't have as much text around it. But you all know this text, whether or not you know where it came from or not. I'll read it and you'll know it. So, Daber al bnei Yisrael v'amarta alehem ve'asu lahem tzitzit al kanfei bidehem ledoratam v'natnu al tzitzit hakanaf b'til techelet. We say this in the third paragraph of the Shema, however many times you say the Shema during your day. And you see here that that anyone who considers himself to be a Jew should have fringes on the corners of their garments. Remember that garments back in the day used to have many more corners than ours do today. Most of us do not wear cornered garments on a regular basis. And then it talks about the patil techelet. It talks about the string of blue, which we're not going to get into today, but that was an element of the tzitzit. So tying tzitzit onto a garment that has four corners is the aspect of, or not the aspect, is the, what's the word I'm looking for? Is the place from which tzitzit comes from, right? The mitzvah is actually on the garment, not on the wearer. So if you have a garment that has four corners, you are supposed to put tzitzit on it because that garment needs to have tzitzit. And you obviously are the person who then wears it, and so the mitzvah is on you, but the mitzvah is actually on the garment itself. So again, we're back in the Talmud now. And we'll see down here on the bottom, the sages taught in a baraita, everyone is obligated in the mitzvah of ritual fringes, including priests, Levites, Israelites, converts, women, and Canaanite slaves. Rabbi Shimon deems women exempt because the mitzvah of ritual fringes is a positive time-bound mitzvah, and women are exempt from every positive time-bound mitzvah. So I'm not actually sure why I didn't also bold this, so I'll do that now. But what we get here, right, is that the sages who hold much more weight than just one rabbi, by the way, when it comes to the Talmud, the sages hold kind of more water to their statement. Everyone's obligated, right? Women are even listed. Women aren't always listed. When it says everyone, this is how in the more stringent of denominations, sometimes women get left out because everyone doesn't often include women. But here it says women and then they're actually included. So it really is everyone. It's not just everyone men, it's everyone. So everyone is obligated in the mitzvah of ritual fringes. By the way, this is where even Orthodox men allow for women to tie tzitzit, not necessarily wear them, but tie them because that mitzvah can be done by them. The wearing of it, has obviously its issues, hence the class we're in right now. But you'll see here that very quickly a rabbi comes out and says, wait a second, they're actually exempt because it's also time bound, right? There is a time for which we wear a tallit and there are times for which we don't. Ken, do you have a question?
I know Susan has her hand up.
It's strange because here, before you remarked that, women were lumped in with slaves and kids.
Yeah.
But here it includes priests, Levites, and so forth and so on, and women. So it's really strange, and all of a sudden, whoops, we're taking women out of the mix. But it doesn't. Why mention priests and Levites and Israelites? That's everyone.
Exactly. So that was part of the reason that I said that I think that tefillin kind of holds more weight in terms of the controversy of women wearing it versus tallit, which is a little bit more of a broad mitzvah, as you can see here from the number of people who are mentioned for this to be an obligation that they can take on, or that they should take on according to the sages. So the idea that we had to cover all of our bases to make sure that everybody and anybody knew that they were obligated to the wearing of a tallit. The interesting thing that you don't see here, but you'll see in just living in Jewish life around town, is that little boys start to wear tzitzit, typically after they're upsharen, but definitely after they're potty trained. And that's not mentioned here, right? That's not an obligation for them, because again, 3-year-olds are not obligated to really much of anything other than to be a 3-year-old. But the idea that the mitzvah of tzitzit don't include them, to go back to your point of having the females, the slaves, and the children lumped together for tefillin, and yet in today's day, you see many little boys wearing tzitzit all the time, and not necessarily as many women in those same denominations, where you might think that if you went back to the Talmud, that women actually have the obligation, but the kids do not. Yeah, Rabbi Dinan, and then Susan.
Very quickly, so to Ken's question about why list everything, is there are a lot of different mitzvot which you need different categories. For example, Kohanim, priests, are not allowed to go near a body of somebody who has passed away, et cetera, like that. So what they're doing here is they're essentially being exhaustive. Like Rabbi Schatz was saying, they really want to say everybody. So if we're going to say everybody, we're going to use literally every different category that comes up in halachic situations. Now, it doesn't talk about, there's a few others like tumtum and androgynous, people whose genders are not necessarily clear, but this is a pretty exhaustive list. Meaning, if you're writing a book on mitzvot and you have all the laws for men, all the laws for women, but there's also a section for priests, section for Levites, a section for converts, it's no. In every single one of these categories are mitzvot, which makes Rabbi Shimon's disagreement, this fundamental disagreement about who is obligated in, or whether it's time bound, even more, striking.
Yeah, Susan.
Yeah, I noticed that it mentions Canaanite slaves. I thought we had established that Canaanite slaves are not obligated to do what Jews are obligated to do.
Rabbi Dinan?
Yeah, so Canaanite slaves are in this middle category because they're not Jewish. If they are freed, they become fully Jewish. So there's this middle category versus someone who's a Jew, let's say a Jewish male, they're obligated in almost all mitzvot. Once they sell themselves, then they become exempt from certain mitzvot, but they're fundamentally Jewish. A Canaanite slave is non-Jewish. Once they become a slave, there are certain things they have to keep because they're in the house, like not working on Shabbat. Some of the things I actually don't know all the whole list of them, but there's certain things that they're obligated to keep because they're in the house of the master, but they're not Jewish. However, they're not a non-Jew anymore. They're in a middle category. So like I said before, to Ken's question, there's so many different variations, and it's saying every variation, every category is included here in tzitzit. So Canaanite slaves are not Jews, they're not Israelites, but they're not non-Jews either. So it's even a different category than the non-Jewish maintenance worker who might be respectful of our practices, but doesn't have to do anything. And today we don't have non-Jewish bondsmen, but it's another category altogether that's not quite Jewish. So hence the confusion, Susan, I validate that. It's a confusing category, but we don't really have anymore. Rabbi Schatz.
Okay, so we're gonna just do one last little piece, and then my assumption is that you end at the hour, but if people wanted to ask extra questions, or I'm sorry that I took so much time to get through the source sheet, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people have.
You're why we're here, Rabbi.
Well, I appreciate that, but I also don't mean to take any more of your time that you don't want to spend. Okay, so again, this is the Pineni Halacha, and he's quoting Rav Moshe Feinstein, both modern day poskim, people who are writing Jewish law in our day today, quite literally. Well, Rav Moshe Feinstein isn't, but Rav Eliezer Melamed still might be still, though. I'm not.
Yeah, he's very much alive. He's in Israel. He's the Rosh Hashiva.
He's alive, but is he still writing?
Oh yeah, he's on Facebook all the time.
Oh, great. Okay, fantastic. Good for him. All right. So Facebook, the place where we find all of our good Jewish law. Rav Moshe Feinstein addresses this issue thoroughly and writes that if a woman's purpose in wrapping herself in tzitzit is for God's sake, she may do so, and it is a credit to her. So this is different than what we saw about tefillin, right? That if a woman was doing it, that she doesn't have the highest reward that a man does. But this is a really beautiful way of Rav Moshe Feinstein, who was an Orthodox man, saying if she's doing it because it brings her comfort for her prayer service, that she should be credited for that, that she should take some reward for that. She should use a garment that looks different from a man's tallit. So this is an interesting thing that some women, myself included, feel like wearing a quote woman's tallit is actually more of a statement of like, look at me, I'm a woman wearing a tallis, than if I just wear a regular, I don't know what that means. But if I wear a traditional looking tallis or a more neutral tallis without your stereotypical female adornments like lace or certain colors, etc. According to the Ashkenazi custom, she may recite the bracha. So some people would say that if a woman is going to put on a tallis, because she is not obligated to do so, she shouldn't say the blessing. Others would say, no, she should say the blessing because she's putting on something that has a blessing that goes with it, and therefore it should be said. If she wishes to wrap herself in tzitzit because of external influence and her purpose is to fight for the cause of feminism, and she wishes to join the fray out of resentment and in order to change the laws of the Torah, it constitutes a denial of the Torah and she forfeits her share in the next world. So we're actually not going to read so much more, but I would have stopped. Like I would have heard this from Rav Moshe Feinstein and be like, okay, you were doing so great. Just stop right before that sentence. Just stop. You were doing fine. Because what he's basically saying is, if you're using it as a statement to say, I'm a woman and I can, then there's a problem. Is there actually a problem? No. Are you making a political statement? Maybe. Is it the correct political statement? Probably. So there is an issue for me around Rav Moshe Feinstein saying this. I usually like the guy quite a lot, actually. This sentence I'm not such a fan of, but I just wanted you to hear it because it is a trope that is understood in the world of specifically Orthodox Judaism. If you see like Women of the Wall, some of that comes from this, right? Kind of claiming a space politically, whether or not you agree with Women of the Wall or not, but just this idea of using a ritual item, a ritual practice, a ritual space to make a statement, could be seen as kind of against the order of things. And so there's this constant kind of inner battle with myself of, is it a performative mitzvah, right? Is it one that I want other girls and other females to see as available to them and that I'm proud that I'm able to choose? Or is it a mitzvah that I actually feel connected to? And during the year of COVID, when we didn't have Minyan in person, I didn't wear my tallis or tefillin unless I was in an in-person Minyan, which was mostly on Shabbat. So I probably didn't wear tefillin for most of a year, if not a little bit more than a year. And that was a learning process for me, right? That was something that I had to work myself through. And even when I read these texts, I think to myself, which category do I put myself in? Do I feel obligated? I definitely don't feel like it's forbidden, or do I feel exempt from it and able to constantly be choosing?